Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Pineda, and our topic for today is neurotoxicology. Neurotoxicology is a broad topic and would encompass both biologic and synthetic toxins. And as to medications, we know that each drug, if given in excess, has the potential to produce a range of adverse effects. Therefore, therapeutics and toxicology are closely linked. In your textbook, there is no consolidated chapter on neurotoxicology. There are several chapters that will discuss adverse effects of drugs and substances to the central and peripheral nervous system, but majority of the specific neurotoxins are covered in chapter 42 of the 11th edition of Adams and Victor's Principles of Neurology. This lecture aims to provide a foundation and a framework on how to approach neurotoxicology. Much of the content in your textbook goes into the specific manifestations and the specific neurotoxins. So I wanted to provide an overview of what neurotoxicology is about and how one is to approach it. These are our learning objectives for today. At the end of the lecture, you're expected to be able to define neurotoxicology, neurotoxins, and neurotoxidromes, identify examples of neurotoxic substances and describe their mechanisms of toxicity, recognize the clinical manifestations of the different neurotoxidromes, and lastly, formulate a diagnostic and therapeutic approach to patients presenting with neurotoxicity or neurotoxicological syndromes. This is a brief outline of what this lecture will cover for today. Okay, so let's first go through a few definitions. So when we speak of neurotoxicology, this is defined as a science that deals with the adverse effects of naturally occurring and synthetic chemical agents on the structure or function of the nervous system. When we speak of neurotoxins, it is a naturally occurring or synthetic chemical agent that can cause a functional or structural change in the central or peripheral nervous system. And lastly, when we speak of toxidromes, these are toxic syndromes or a constellation of signs and symptoms associated with a class of toxins. And this is also reflective of the susceptibility of the different portions of the nervous system to toxins. Here we have a diagram depicting that the onset of symptomatic disease following neurotoxin exposure is a function of the extent of exposure to the neurotoxin and reflective of the rate of neuronal loss as a result of the exposure. So early on, we can predict that the higher the exposure to the neurotoxin, the earlier would be the manifestation of the symptoms, and the rate of loss will determine how fast the deterioration of the patient would be. Several studies have looked into the different mechanisms of neurotoxicity and have identified three main mechanisms. First, via excitotoxicity. So this occurs when nerve cells are overstimulated by neurotransmitters, leading to excessive calcium influx and cell death. Second, via oxidative stress. This occurs when there is an imbalance between free radicals and antioxidants, leading to cell damage and death. And lastly, via mitochondrial dysfunction. This occurs when there is a disruption in the production of energy in the cell, leading to cell death. In understanding neurotoxicology and its classification, we may either look at a specific inciting toxic agent or the common clinical manifestations. Of course, there are certain limitations to approaching neurotoxic syndromes in terms of specific toxic agents because matching of a chemical structure to neurotoxicity is often unpredictable. Also, when patients present in the clinics or in the emergency room, they present with symptoms, and information about the specific neurotoxin may not be always available. Of course, our alternative is to consider the different neurotoxic syndromes in terms of their clinical presentation. For example, do they present with primarily encephalopathies, movement disorders, peripheral neuropathies, skeletal muscle issues, psychiatric or behavioral symptoms, visual system disturbances, or disturbances of the special senses. And the challenge, of course, with this approach is that many forms of neurotoxicity are expressed as a complex syndrome involving both the peripheral and the central nervous systems, with neurological as well as psychiatric signs. It's important to remember that when we approach neurotoxicity, it's important to remember that all systems of neurons are not identical. Each has its own vulnerabilities to particular drugs and toxic agents, and this is aptly called a selective vulnerability. And as we continue with our discussion, you will notice later on that there are preferential effects of toxins on different portions of the nervous system. Some would be preferentially affecting the central nervous system, some would be preferentially affecting the peripheral nervous system. Not only may certain groups of nerve cells be selectively destroyed by a particular agent, but also sometimes the agents would have preference to particular portions of the structure of the neuron. Toxins may have preferential effects on terminal axons, dendrites, neurofilaments, or even receptors on the pre and postsynaptic surfaces of neurons, or maybe affect their metabolic activities, whereby they synthesize and release neurotransmitters or maintain their cellular integrity by synthesis of RNA, DNA, or other proteins. As I alluded to earlier, if we look at the classification of neurotoxicity based on toxic agents, there are five major classifications: sympathomimetics, anticholinergics, cholinergics, opioids, and sedative hypnotics. And you also see here a listing of common molecules and common agents presenting with these toxidromes. Examples of sympathomimetic agents include amphetamine, methamphetamine, cocaine, pseudoephedrine, phenylephrine, methylphenidate, ephedra, caffeine, and bath salts. Common anticholinergics include antihistamines, tricyclic antidepressants, phenothiazines, antispasmodics, skeletal muscle relaxants, and other plant derivatives. Cholinergic agents include nicotine, medications for neuromuscular junction diseases such as myasthenia gravis, which includes neostigmine, physostigmine, and pyridostigmine. You have also dementia medications such as galantamine, donepezil, tacrine, and rivastigmine, which are classified as cholinergics. Carbamate insecticides and organophosphate insecticides are known to cause cholinergic symptomatology as well. Examples of opioids are morphine, oxymorphone, hydromorphone, meperidine, methadone, fentanyl, heroin, pentazocine, and tramadol. And lastly, your sedative hypnotics include your anti-epileptic drugs, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, antipsychotics, and ethanol. And looking at this list, one is able to predict already the range of symptoms associated with a particular agent or a particular neurotoxin, depending on its specific category. So this is useful when the inciting agent is known. Therefore, you're able to correctly predict the symptomatology. However, most of the time, as I mentioned earlier, in the emergency room, sometimes we lack this information and we need to do further investigation based on the clinical presentation of your patients. Therefore, it is still of value to know the common clinical presentation of neurotoxicity, including the usual inciting agents. Acute encephalopathy is a common presenting symptom of neurotoxicity. Majority are mild and resolve within a few days. Typical accompanying signs and symptoms include headache, tiredness, confusion, loss of attention, short-term memory loss, lack of motor coordination, gait disturbances, nausea and dizziness. Typical inciting agents include cannabis, cocaine, domoic acid, lead, organic solvents, aluminum, and trimethyltin. In some instances, the acute signs may progress, severely impacting functionality of the patient. So some would transition to a more protracted chronic and severe encephalopathy, but association of with loss of cognition and psychomotor function is relatively uncommon. But when present, this may be due to exposure to domoic acid, aluminum, lead, cadmium, and chronic use of alcohol or organic solvents. Cerebellar dysfunction characterized by ataxia, intention tremor, and loss of coordination is a known feature with chronic exposure to mercury. However, overdose with a variety of other toxic agents and chemicals such as 5-fluorouracil, lithium, and acrylamide have also been implicated. Extrapyramidal syndromes such as Parkinsonism, dystonias, dyskinesias, and tics are well-known toxic syndromes. Although the mechanisms are poorly understood, these are usually reversible. Parkinsonism is best known following the outbreak of MPTP or 1-methyl-4-phenyl-1,2,3,6 tetrahydropyridine, which is a contaminant of some drugs of abuse. Most syndromes occur as a result of overenthusiastic use of drugs such as phenothiazines rather than an exposure to non-therapeutic chemicals. This slide summarizes some of the movement disorders and the typical causative agents associated with them. So I think this is valuable to know, especially in the clinics. And this underlines the importance of doing a very good history when you are presented with patients with new onset symptoms. That's why we always emphasize for you to go through the medication list of your patients because some of the manifestations may actually be adverse effects or neurotoxic effects of the medications being given to patients. Toxic syndromes involving skeletal muscles are relatively uncommon and mostly is a result of denervation. And once a causative agent is removed, muscles tend to regenerate rapidly. Some of the known myotoxic agents include clofibrate and organophosphates, which are known to cause rhabdomyolysis. Diacylcholesterols and herbicides are known to cause myotonic activity. Licorice plant derivatives, diuretics, and alcohol abuse is known to cause hypokalemic periodic paralysis. Behavioral and psychiatric symptoms may be clinical presentations of neurotoxic syndromes. The manifestations are highly variable. Some of these patients will present with depression, anxiety, forgetfulness, symptoms of brain fog, or that nondescript feeling of not feeling okay or not feeling right. But most of these symptoms are relatively mild, often ignored and ascribed to other potential causes. But some of the more severe ones include that of a dementia-like syndrome, which is associated with aluminum toxicity, and also severe psychotic disorders associated with lysergic acid diethylamide or LSD abuse. Neurotoxins may also cause dysfunctions in the visual and special sensory systems. The use of organic solvents, for example, is known to cause dysfunction in taste and smell. Loss of hearing is associated with toluene use and use of ototoxic drugs such as aminoglycosides and platinum analogs. Mydriasis is associated with the use of parasympatholytics, whereas meiosis is associated with the use of parasympathomimetics. Nystagmus is associated with phenytoin and aminoglycoside use. Optic neuropathy is associated with toluene use, and widespread visual system damage is associated with methanol or ethanol abuse. In the next few slides, I will walk you through the approach to patients with suspected neurotoxicity or suspected neurotoxin exposure. In a patient with suspected neurotoxicity, a brief initial screening examination should be performed on all patients, and this is to identify immediate measures required to stabilize and prevent deterioration of your patient. You need to assess airway, vital signs, mental status, pupillary size, and skin temperature, particularly the core body temperature of the patient, especially if there is associated altered sensorium in the patient. It's important to expose the patient completely, look for signs of trauma, evidence of needle tracks, which may suggest drug use, infection, or other potential causative agents. It's important to search through the patient's clothing, wallets, looking for pill bottles, pills, and other drug-related equipment because this may potentially direct your diagnostic evaluation. History, of course, is very important in trying to establish the etiology of the toxicity. However, at the level of the emergency room, this is not always possible. It's very difficult to obtain a reliable history because oftentimes there is no informant available, or the patients may not be forthcoming with the correct information. So it's very important that at the level of the emergency room, whatever history that you get, it's very important to correlate this with signs and symptoms in the expected laboratory data from the toxidromes that you were able to establish based on the history. It's also critical to inquire specifically about the use of over-the-counter medications. Traditional or herbal remedies and dietary supplements are often not considered to be medications by patients and may not be volunteered. Hence, you really do need to go through a list of uh, review of medications when getting the history. Following the initial diagnostic evaluation and stabilization, other physical examination findings should be sought to further identify a particular toxic syndrome or toxidrome for one to further narrow the potential etiologies of poisoning or neurotoxicity. The physical examination of symptomatic poisoned patients or intoxicated patients may provide invaluable clues to the agent involved. The mental status examination, vital signs, pupillary examination are all useful elements and will allow for us to classify if the patient is in a state of physiologic excitation, physiologic depression, or a mix of both. Physiologic excitation is manifested by central nervous system stimulation and increased pulse, blood pressure, respiratory rate, and depth and temperature. It's most commonly caused by anticholinergic, sympathomimetic, or central hallucinogenic agents or by drug withdrawal states. On the other hand, when we speak of physiologic depression, this is manifested by a depressed mental status, blood pressure, decreased pulse, respiratory rate and depth, and decreased temperature. And this is most commonly precipitated by ethanol, other sedative hypnotics, opioids, cholinergic or parasympathomimetic agents, sympatholytics, or toxic alcohols such as methanol or ethylene glycol poisoning or intoxication. Mixed physiologic effects may occur in polydrug overdoses or following exposure to certain metabolic poisons, such as salicylates, cyanide, membrane active agents such as volatile inhalants, antiarrhythmic drugs, and local anesthetic agents, some heavy metals such as iron, arsenic, mercury, or lead, and other agents with multiple mechanisms of action, such as tricyclic antidepressants. Okay, so this is a good algorithm to follow in our approach to patients with suspected neurotoxin exposure or neurotoxidrome. So, of course, emphasis on rapid stabilization at the level of the emergency room is emphasized, as well as provisions for supportive care depending on the symptomatology of the patient. But what this provides us is a guide on how to examine the patient in order to establish whether the patient is in a state of physiologic depression or physiologic excitation. It also lists down the different major classifications of causative agents and the common associated clinical findings when exposure to these causative agents are suspected. So I will leave this with you for you to go through on your own. And what's important here is to go through the common categories of the causative agents and be familiar with the common clinical findings associated with them. Apart from stabilization and physical examination of your patient, some immediate diagnostic studies need to be performed at the level of the emergency room, including pulse oximetry and glucose measurement, especially in patients with altered sensorium. So, rapid bedside glucometers are the most expedient method to determine presence of hypoglycemia, which may cause alterations in sensorium and encephalopathy. And in empiric administration of dextrose or glucose containing fluids is recommended for patients with altered consciousness when bedside glucose measurements are low, borderline low, or not immediately available. ECG should be performed on all patients who are symptomatic or who have been exposed to potentially cardiotoxic agents or unknown substances, as it may provide diagnostic and prognostic information. So, special attention should be paid to the duration of QRS and QTC intervals. Many drugs that cause sodium channel blockade, such as cocaine, tricyclic antidepressants, some anti-epileptic drugs such as carbamazepine may cause prolongation of the QRS interval. Many other drugs may block potassium efflux, such as your antipsychotics, which may cause prolongation of the QT interval. This slide extensively summarizes the different common ECG abnormalities and typical causative agents associated with them. So very important to know this. I will leave this with you for you to understand and be very familiar with. Toxicology screening is rarely necessary when patients with an unintentional ingestion are asymptomatic or have clinical findings already consistent with the medical history that you obtained. However, screening for acetaminophen and salicylates may be necessary for patients with an uncertain history or intentional poisoning. Drugs of abuse immunoassay screens may be used to detect opioids, benzodiazepines, cocaine metabolites, barbiturates, TCAs, tetrahydrocannabinol, methamphetamine, and methadone in the urine, and they are relatively inexpensive and provide rapid results. However, they may be of limited value in acute clinical management, but may be indicated in the presence of drug-induced seizures, cardiovascular events, and new onset psychosis, especially if there is no clear causative agent that is determined from the history. Imaging studies are typically not required in every patient presenting with a neurotoxidrome. However, it may be useful in certain situations, especially if you're thinking of the causative agents are radio-opaque toxins, because these radio-opaque toxins, as is listed here on the right side, may be visualized by plain film radiographs. Also, non-cardiogenic pulmonary edema and/or acute respiratory distress syndrome, possibly due to exposure to certain toxic agents such as ammonia gas, heroin, certain heavy metals, beta blockers, kerosene, and butane, may be seen through plain chest radiographs. ABGs are important to do, or your blood gases are important to determine acid-base disturbances associated with a particular agent. Co-oximetry is important for rapid diagnosis of carbon monoxide poisoning and methemoglobinemia. Presence of an ion gap metabolic acidosis is usually a first clue to a toxic ingestion, and this should prompt consideration of causative agents such as salicylates, ethylene glycol, and methanol toxicity, while those with an elevated osmolarity or osmolar gap without metabolic acidosis is common from toxicity coming from isopropyl alcohol and beta hydroxybutyrate. We now go to treatment. So treatment variably includes four pillars: decontamination, antidotal therapy, enhanced elimination techniques, and supportive therapy. Optimal management of a poisoned patient or an intoxicated patient would depend on the specific poison or the specific toxin involved, and the presenting and predicted severity of illness, including the elapsed time between the exposure and the presentation of your patient. First, we go to decontamination. So, following initial patient stabilization, patient decontamination may be performed if indicated. The sooner the decontamination is done, the more effective it is at preventing poison or toxin absorption. So typically, this is done with copious water or saline irrigation for topical exposures and administration of activated charcoal for ingestions, which are the preferred methods of decontamination for majority of cases. In certain circumstances, other methods of gastrointestinal decontamination may be warranted, such as whole bowel irrigation, endoscopy, surgery, dilution, or the use of cathartics. Supportive care is the cornerstone of treatment. However, in certain instances, antidotes may be indicated, especially if the administration of these antidotes is potentially life-saving. So, antidotes may reduce or reverse toxin exposure or toxin effects by a variety of means. First, they may prevent absorption, particularly with the use of activated charcoals. They bind and neutralize poisons directly. They may antagonize end organ effects or inhibit conversion to more toxic metabolites. Antidote administration is appropriate when actual or predicted severity of poisoning would warrant its use, and the expected benefits of therapy outweigh the associated risks. Antidotes are also known to dramatically reduce morbidity and mortality in certain intoxications, but are unavailable for most toxic agents, therefore, are used only in a small fraction of cases. And here you see on the right side would be common toxins or common poisons and their known antidotes. Okay, so we now go to enhanced elimination techniques. General indications include: 1. Ingestion of a poison whose elimination can be enhanced. 2. Failure of a patient to respond to maximal supportive care. And lastly, if the clinical course is predicted to be complicated based on the nature or concentration of the toxin, impaired clearance of the toxin, presence of comorbid illnesses, and presence of concomitant severe electrolyte or other metabolic derangements. And among the methods used, one of the more common will be the multiple dose activated charcoal or MDAC. This is a common method for enhancing elimination of toxins and may play a specific role in certain poisonings or certain toxin exposures. Another method is your forced diuresis using isotonic saline, lactated ringer solution, or diuretics. And when used, you want to target urine flow rates of 3 to 5 ml per kilogram per hour. And this is to force renal clearance of the toxin. Primary toxins with a high level of renal excretion include bromides, lithium, amphetamine, phenobarbital, and salicylates. Other means of extracorporeal methods include hemodialysis, hemoperfusion, hemofiltration, plasmapheresis, and exchange transfusion. And extracorporeal indication is typically used for agents whose hemodialysis clearance is significantly greater than endogenous clearance. So, especially in patients with progressive deterioration or those predictive to have poor outcome. So, especially in patients with significant exposure to barbiturates, pregabalin, gabapentin, theophylline, valproate, methotrexate, and other substances such as acetaminophen and aminoglycosides. Other known techniques, but usually used only in specific situations, include your cation exchanger binding in intestinal tract, chelation therapy, CSF removal, enterohepatic circulatory binding of toxins, hyperbaric oxygen, IV lipid emulsion therapy, specific antibody toxin binding, and whole bowel irrigation. As I mentioned earlier, supportive care is a cornerstone of treatment of patients exposed to neurotoxins. And very important to remember that we need to treat our patients, not the poison. So most of these patients, as we went through the different algorithms and different symptomatologies, they may present with a variety of symptoms, but these the ones listed here on the left are the symptoms needing immediate supportive treatment. So, patients presenting with seizures, agitation, respiratory failure, hypotension or hypertension, arrhythmias in the form of ventricular tachycardia, supraventricular tachycardia, or bradyarrhythmias, and also those presenting with hyperthermia or hypothermia. Why are these important to treat? Because these may potentially impact on the functional outcome of your patient. Specifically for seizures, drug-induced seizures are generally best treated with benzodiazepines, followed by barbiturates if necessary, or if they do not respond completely to benzodiazepines. Phenytoin is typically not recommended, but in certain situations may be of value, such as that of dalfampridine poisoning. And levetiracetam is unlikely to be successful in controlling toxin-induced seizures based on several studies. Patients presenting with drug-induced agitations respond well to benzodiazepine treatment. However, some patients may be refractory to benzodiazepine but may respond to phenobarbital or propofol. In specific patients with anticholinergic syndrome presenting with agitation, physostigmine may be of value in controlling this. A common question that we are asked at the level of the emergency room is if we need to admit all patients with suspected neurotoxin exposure into the ICU. And the answer actually is dependent on One, your initial evaluation of the patient, including your physical and neurologic examination. Two, if you're able to establish the inciting or causative agent. Third, um, the initial laboratory or diagnostic tests that you did for the patient. So, in the presence of elevated partial pressures of your carbon dioxide more than 45 millimeters mercury, if there is a need for emergency intubation, if the patient is unresponsive to verbal stimuli, therefore has decreased level of sensorium, if the patient's presented with seizures, presence of cardiac rhythm abnormalities, um, and prolonged QRS interval, unstable vital signs, these patients need to be admitted at the ICU for careful observation and timely intervention if need be. Okay, so in summary, the initial evaluation and stabilization of a patient presenting with a neurotoxidrome should precede any further detailed history taking because you know that history may be unreliable due to several factors affecting the patient's sensorium or willingness to divulge information. Clinical presentation is highly dependent on the type of neurotoxin exposure. Diagnostic tests are done for quick identification of potential complications specific to the neurotoxin. Toxicology screens show limited use in clinical practice. And lastly, treatment pillars include decontamination, antidotal therapy, enhanced elimination, and supportive therapy. And I think that is my last slide. Thank you very much for your kind attention.